Hello, everyone, and good evening. We are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Newberry. I'm Rose Myron. I am the director of the Darcy McNichol Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies here at the library, and I'm also one of the co-directors of the Indigenous Chicago Project and one of the co-curators of the Indigenous Chicago exhibition. So to everyone here in the room and also everybody who is tuning in on the live stream, thank you so much for joining us for this program, Indigenous People in the Chicago Portage. If you are new to the Newberry or you have never visited us before, I want to just tell you a little bit about our institution. We aim to support and inspire research, teaching, and learning in the humanities through our reading rooms, exhibition galleries, program spaces, classrooms, and online digital resources. The program tonight is part of Indigenous Chicago, which is a larger, multifaceted initiative that the library has worked on closely with Native community members for almost the last 5 years. The project includes an exhibition, a website with several digital mapping components, high school curriculum, new oral histories with community members, and public programs like this one. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, I want to say a little bit about the project, which was developed with the goal of bringing more visibility to Chicago's Native past, present, and future in mind. So the place that we now call Chicago is located near the confluence of several important waterways, and it sits on land that intersects with the ancestral homelands of many tribal nations. These nations include the Anishinaabe, which includes the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa people, the Illinois Confederation, which includes the Peoria and Kaskaskia nations, among others, and the Miamia, Wea, Ho-Chunk, Sauk, and Meskwaki nations. The Menominee, Kickapoo, and Mascoutin nations also call the region of Northeast Illinois home. Indigenous people continue to live in the Chicago region and to celebrate their traditional teachings and lifeways. And today, Chicago is home to one of the largest urban Indigenous communities in the United States, and this land remains an important place for Indigenous people. As a Chicago institution, it is the Newberry's responsibility to acknowledge this historical context and to build reciprocal relationships with tribal nations on whose lands we are situated. We really see Indigenous Chicago and the ongoing partnerships that we hold with tribal nations and members of the local Native community as an important part of this responsibility. This project began with informal conversations with community members in 2019, and it was officially launched at a community meeting that was held in January of 2020. In this meeting, community members chose the 5 project components and identified 6 project goals that have guided the project since then. Over the next 4 years, we held several more open community meetings. We assembled a 25-person advisory group on which Eric and Raphael both served. And we met at least monthly, distributed a community survey. We had booths at regional powwows, hosted several community oral history days, and dozens of additional in-person and virtual community presentations with opportunities to provide feedback. This project will be an ongoing initiative, and we hope that in addition to attending this program, you also have the opportunity to explore the exhibition, which is open, and the project's other aspects through our website, indigenous-chicago.org. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, I want to let you know that we will be managing our Q&A for tonight's conversation by asking you to text questions to the number on this screen, 833-899-3399. So whether you're here with us in person or joining us on the live stream, I very much encourage you to text questions to this number while you're listening to our speakers tonight, and we will get through as many as we can in the time that we have available. And with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. So Eric Hemenway is Anishinaabe and Odawa and serves as the Director of Repatriation, Archives, and Records for the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians of Waganakising, the land of the crooked tree, which is located in the northwest portion of the lower Michigan Peninsula. He has a lifelong involvement in researching Odawa history, collaborating widely with museums, universities, the National Park Service, schools, and various governments in conducting and presenting research to a wide range of audiences, including to students, staff, faculty, and the general public. He has a wide range of speaking experiences, writing accomplishments, and media projects. John William Nelson is an assistant professor of history at Texas Tech University. His research explores the way ecology and geography shaped the terms of cross-cultural interaction between Native peoples and European colonizers from first contact through the early Republican era of the United States. He is the author of Muddy Ground, Native Peoples, Chicago's Portage, and the Transformation of a Continent, which explores how a particular local landscape along Chicago's continental divide influenced colonial encounters from the 17th through the 19th centuries. And Raphael Wahwassuck is a tribal council member and tribal historic preservation officer for the Prairie Band of Potawatomi. He grew up living between Topeka and the Potawatomi Reservation for most of his life, and he has a degree in organizational management and leadership. In his professional life, Wahwassuck worked in the tribal judicial system for a number of years. He also worked on federal grants for different tribes throughout the country. He enjoys the opportunity to share his traditions and educate people about his culture. And so with that, I am going to kick off the conversation tonight with an initial question for our speakers, and then really let them take it away and have a conversation amongst each other. So I'm going to ask you all to start by talking about some of the historical ways that Indigenous groups utilized Chicago's unique geography as a network of canoe routes, portages, and riverways, but also as a place of wetlands, waterlogged prairies, and lake shores.
All right. I guess I'll start and then defer from there. So thanks, Rose, and thanks to the Newberry for having me here, having us all here. It's a real honor to be up here sharing this stage tonight and having all of you here. To answer that question, right, about kind of the historical ways Native people interacted with Chicago, we really have to look before Europeans ever show up, right? It's not Chicago's history doesn't start when the French arrive, despite what textbooks or grade schools may have told us, right? Native people were here long before Marquette and Joliet arrived. It's how the French even knew to come here, right? There were Siouan-speaking Oneota people here pre-contact that we can see in the archaeological record and have distinct ties to the Ho-Chunk today, and they were exploiting this region because of its rich wetland resources. The other draw to Chicago for Indigenous people long before Europeans was, of course, the intersecting waterways here. So Chicago's Portage or Portage was actually kind of a series of these canoe routes, overland carriages that would connect the waters of the Chicago River with the headwaters of the Des Plaines, which then flowed into the Illinois and the Mississippi River. And there's clear archaeological evidence for this of trade routes that flowed through Chicago long before Europeans ever touched ground here. So you had groups further north, like the Anishinaabe, Odawa, and Ojibwe peoples further up the lakes who would trade things like furs and porcupine quills south through this route. Local Potawatomi headmen would also use this route to kind of proffer goods south to the Illinois country, and Illinois merchants, indigenous Illinoisans from further south, as well as Miami farmers, would use the route to ship their goods north, right? Whether that be bison robes or excess agricultural products, or more tragically, indigenous captives from further south and west. And so this was an indigenous trade route and an indigenous space of movement long before Europeans arrived. Other thoughts on that?
Got a few thoughts.
Yeah, good.
So I come from an area that's about, 250 miles north of here, Waganakising. But before I get started, I want to give a traditional introduction of who I am. I want to do that at any place that I go to, because these were the words that were spoken, the sounds that were spoken thousands of years ago by my ancestors, and I want to honor that by being in this place. Ganabik and Disnakas, Anmatikamek, Waganakising and Donjiba, Anishinaabe, Odawa, Endau, and Jijik Dodem, and Gichendum, Mapi, Tumandoki, Minamabana Ziwan, Minwa Injinkian, Mapi, Shikag, and Miigwech for the Zogpog Nangwa. So it's a little bit of my Anishinaabe Moan language. I made a bunch of mistakes. You probably didn't notice, but they were there 100%. But it's important for me to do that because in talking about place and people, and a lot of it starts with what they were saying, what they were speaking. So this was one of the languages that was spoken in this area 10,000 years ago. So I want to acknowledge that we're still thriving or trying to thrive in our language. So I'll translate real quickly. One of my native names is Ganabik. That means a snake. So snakes are good. They're not bad. Some cultures are not so looked upon so good, but for us as Anishinaabe people, they're pretty good. And they're in the water a lot. So water has a lot of levels with culture, trade, who we are as identity. I come from the place of the prayer tree on Matikamekw, and also known with the larger area of Waganakising, land of the crooked tree, up near the Straits of Mackinac. So that's where my people are from. And I self-identify as an Anishinaabe Odawa, and the Anishinaabe are one of the indigenous peoples to the Great Lakes. We're not the only indigenous people. And I'm just telling you how I identify. You could have 10 natives up here, and they're going to give you 10 different answers, and they're all correct. So I'm Anishinaabe, and I'm part of the Crane clan. And so what I was taught that within our cosmos, there's animal relations that come to lend their help, and mine is the crane, like the bird. So we have bear, eagle, wolf, marten, loon, big families. And a lot of it's tied to water, especially cranes. And I am the director of Archives and Records. I said I'm really happy to be here, and I'm happy for the snow that's out there right now. And being in this place is, yes, there's lots of trade, there's lots of movement, but there's also this place that for Odawa people of coming and meeting. And traditionally, my ancestors would come down here in the winter. And so when I tell people, you know, my ancestors went south for the winter, they're like, oh, Florida, and I'm like, no, Chicago. They're like, oh. But compared to northern Michigan in January in 1600, you'd come down here too. Yeah. So people came and they moved, but they never left the Great Lakes. So the Odawa, they moved around, but they never left. They would come to Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ontario, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, what we know today. But that was all what we call Anishinaabe Aki. The land of the Anishinaabe. So everything was in this area, whether it was for food, trade, diplomacy, and also just interacting with other people. So this was one of these key areas that my ancestors would come into during primarily the winter months and spend the winter with other Potawatomis, Samayamas. And so there was networking, there was family building, kinship networks that were being built. And these kinship networks, in my mind, were like a spider web throughout the Great Lakes. We have, notes and records of Odawas at Winnipeg, Saskatchewan, Manitoulin Island. They're everywhere. And this is all out of sometimes necessity, but sometimes out of, American, European policy. But a lot of times it was out of this very old way of life that interacted with the environment on a very intricate and intimate level. And being in this area of southern Lake Michigan, just reinforces the idea that the lakes are always home. So they come down here, and yes, they would build their homes. They would come down here to meet with other people, to build relationships. But then this place became this focal point of resistance. And as we're gearing up as a country, pretty soon here for the 250th anniversary of America, big deal. A lot of people are doing a lot of things, myself included. I'm thinking about the resistance and the idea of invasion, that as Europeans and Americans invaded this land and fought for it and were taking, what is the viewpoint looking east of Native people? And Chicago became one of these areas of resistance. So War of 1812, we were just talking with Rose earlier about this, Little Turtles War, 1790 through 95, Treaty of Greenville. Like, these are things that shape America that nobody really talks about. But they absolutely shaped the Anishinaabe people. And this is one of these focal points for this. And Battle Fort Dearborn gets a lot of play, gets a lot of misinterpretation, a lot of misunderstanding, but it's part of this larger resistance to invasion. So when I come to this area, I think about that quite a bit. These people are coming and utilizing these waterways, old traditions of travel, but to meet a new threat, a new thing that was in their presence called the United States of America. So I think about that a lot, and as we're gearing up for the 250th. And my ancestors paddled canoes down here. I took a plane. They're a little tougher than I am. But I'm here, so I want to acknowledge that.
That was my bright idea to go last, and that was probably the wrong choice with this story. But no, thank you. I'm honored to be here tonight to share a little bit with all of you folks. And so, unlike my counterparts here, I'm going to take a little more of a different position in communicating about this evening. We have a little bit of snow on the ground, and in our culture, that opens it up for me to talk a little bit more about some oral histories and traditions that have been shared. As was mentioned, our folks, the Potawatomi, We were transplanted over here also. Some of the origin stories that I'm familiar with have us all the way back over on the East Coast, over around Maine, in that area. And then we, migrated this way, and we sort of landed in this area and called this home until we were forced to move again in the 1800s. When we think about the waterways and how they're connected, I grew up hearing stories of how our people traveled from coast to coast on a regular basis, using, the Portage, the big rivers, getting over to the Missouri, going out west, going all the way down south, around Cahokia. That was a large gathering place for our folks also. And so this location here was very strategic in trade. It was also strategic in, and again, I'm going to share from the perspective that I was taught growing up. So as Eric mentioned, you're going to be able to ask multiple tribal folks, tribal nations, and all of those are going to be accurate histories. So what I'm going to share with you tonight is from the perspective that I was taught growing up. And my understanding for our folks, for my lineage specifically, is that we were sort of enforcers. So when there was conflict, we needed to be able to mobilize quickly to get to where we needed to go to support whatever was happening. And that was another one of the reasons why we based in this area here, so then that way we could mobilize quickly if needed, and then pick up, troops or scouts or whoever we needed to along the way as we navigated back and forth, as we were in the early days of resistance, until eventually some of our leadership made decisions to move in another route. But yeah, these lands, aside from, the strategic advantages of being here, also, the climate, for winter camps, and then also, sustenance. I mean, everything that you need to survive was at one time located in these areas. Of course, I think we'll talk a little bit about, the changes in the river specifically, and the effect that had on the ecosystems. But really, I mean, everything that we needed for our livelihoods was located here.
Great. To kind of roll back the curtain for everyone, we had kind of kicked around different questions that we would all want to kind of touch on. And so one of the other questions that kind of builds right off Raphael's point there, right, is the kind of the changes in the lands and waters around Chicago, especially as it relates to this theme of resistance, right? So we've already talked about how Indigenous people, Anishinaabe people, and others in this area use the waterways strategically for trade and for sustenance. But that begins to change, right, in the 19th century, the 1800s, when the United States starts to lay claim to this place. They build a fort in 1803. Initially, that fort is meant to try to regulate people's movement through this space, right? They want to control Indigenous people's canoe route. It's an explicitly kind of anti-mobility strategy for the Americans, right? Clamp down on the waterborne fluidity of this place. And from there, it gets more and more emphasis on this control, right? So that the Americans eventually want to build a canal where the old Portage exists. They want to drain swamps. They want to survey the lands and plat out a city, build bridges across it, straighten the river, even cut a new channel for the mouth so that canoes aren't the only vessels that can be used in the Chicago River. And so I'm interested, I've kind of laid out some of that, but what's the take on, ways that Native people continue to resist those changes to the environment, but also kind of on the flip side, how does that changing environment threaten Indigenous ways of life at Chicago, really in the 1800s and beyond? Should I kick it to you,
Yeah,
Eric?
well, people ask, I do a lot of public interfacing at this point, a lot of public talking, and
Yeah.
a lot of times I don't fit the mold for a Native. I don't fit the stereotype. And so once they figure out that I'm Native, they expect all this Native knowledge to just pour out of me. Like I'm born with this infinite amount of knowledge and wisdom and language. I have to learn it. And they're like, oh, I'm like, yeah, it's just, you have to learn these things. And a lot of these questions relate to before white people, before Europeans. I'm like, yeah, that's a big part of the story, like tens of thousands of years of the story. But the story has been obliterated when the land is obliterated. And so much of the story is told through the land. And when the land is altered, the story is altered, or it's gone in some regards, because people interacted with the land on a much deeper level than I'll ever understand. Of going to these places for ceremony, for burials, for trade, for war, diplomacy. The action and the story was being lived through the land. So they would go there to these places routinely over and over, like coming down here for the winter, interacting with different people, telling these stories, and they would be at the place, whether it's a tree, a river, a shoreline, a marsh, a wetlands. What happens when the wetlands drained? The story's drained because you can't go there and interact with it on that level anymore. And so over time, it becomes forgotten. And then we have another thing that helps accelerate the loss in Indian boarding schools. So this is going on in the 1800s where it's forcing this change on Native people. And so our environments are changing, our family structures are changing, but it really begins with the environment. And it's, for me, very humbling to sit on a stage with somebody who's also, a Potawatomi, Anishinaabe, but is in Kansas. We're at two different places where this community is moved, and my community was able to avoid that removal. And a lot of it's based on environment, in my opinion. The Illinois area, the Indiana, Ohio, it's prime farming. People want that land more than anything. I live in northern Michigan. Nobody wanted it. It's too cold. It's really sandy. Then they figured out shorelines and sunsets, and then all these resorters came in and started to cut the trees down, drain the wood, drain the swamps, and just alter this land to fit their needs of these resorter communities. It happened almost overnight. So when that happened, I'm from the land of the crooked tree. The tree's gone. But the name is still there. Yeah. The identity is still there with the people, but I can't go to the main tree that once stood on the shoreline. There's other crooked trees, but not the main one that, this very powerful spirit bent. So when this is altered, it happened on so many levels so fast. But the resistance in my mind is, we're here. That's the resistance. Every time a Native person does anything, it's resistance to, 500 years of what we call genocide. I mean, that's going to call it what it is. So anytime a Native person is in existence, that's the resistance, in my mind.
Well said, yeah.
Yeah, man, I mean, you're right on point there. Yeah, and one of the things when I think about a question like this that's always somewhat amusing to me is the fact that the Western science is just now starting to catch up to what our folks have always known by living with our environments and with the places that we occupy, right? And I think this Chicago River is a perfect example of when things go awry there, right? And again, I'm going to speak from the perspective of what was shared with me as a young person growing up. Please, I don't mean to offend anybody here, but one of the stories that was shared with me is that our folks could not believe how unsanitary the people who came in were, right? And, reversing a waterway that just enhanced and expounded on that problem, especially with so many people coming in. And so again, I say when the science is catching up to the ways that we've always practiced and lived, it's good to see that today, right? Because we know, like, some of our traditional fire practices are being reintroduced across the country. When, Smokey the Bear came in and said, oh, no, we don't want you burning down anything. But honestly, that was one of the best things that we could be doing, replenishing the growth, replenishing the soils. And so, as was mentioned, when you restrict and redirect and refocus the energies of our waterways, you know, it really was detrimental to our folks in a manner of, you know, we had to then become adaptive to the new environments that were created because of these things. And so, yeah, you know, resistance to all of that. And again, you know, by us being here today, by me being back on these lands, you know, to share with you folks this evening is an act of that resistance from our ancestors, you know, hundreds of years ago, to be here and to share with you, because we're not supposed to be here, right? We're not supposed to be here anymore, you know. So again, you know, I'm speaking a little off the cuff here. I don't mean offense to anyone by any means, but I feel it's important for me to share from the truthful perspective that I had to grow up in to understand, you know, kind of our history to where we got to.
Yeah, yeah. That's really both really well said. And in terms of, you know, resistance being just survivance, right? And the way that it was supposed to work, right, in the 19th century American officials' minds was that after 1833, after the last treaty at Chicago, removal would happen and Chicago would become a white American space, right? And in many ways, that has been the standard narrative of kind of Chicago's upward trajectory as a city. But as we've seen, right, in recent decades, the environmental factors of Chicago are still very much shaky because of all of this kind of engineering work, rerouting of the rivers, draining of the swamps, attempts at pushing back the shoreline. And it still remains to be seen whether all of that will one day kind of blow up in people's faces. But back to this idea of resistance, I'm interested to hear more about, you know, obviously Native people never go away from Chicago. Even after the removals, even after the treaties, Native people, Anishinaabe people, still claim this space as Indigenous Chicago. And so in this, yeah, of course, in this later history, more modern history of the 20th century, what does that look like, Eric?
Oh, and I mean, just to be totally,
Yeah.
I mean, I get weird when people say, I'm going to be totally honest. I'm like, are you not totally honest all the time?
That's a good point.
I'm going to be totally honest.
Yeah.
Like, my tribe came down here, like, I call it level 2. Like, this isn't our first place.
Right.
You know, Northern Michigan's our first place. And so I'm like, sort of on the outside looking in.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You know, like my ancestors, some of them, not every Odawa came down here for the winter. Some went to, you know, Battle Creek or Kalamazoo, or I think the real ornery ones stayed in Northern Michigan for the whole winter because that's just how they were. So different families chose their spots.
Mm-hmm.
And as this thing called American Progress went forward, I think some Odawas started to pull back. And say, this spot ain't going to work for us anymore like it used to. Now, some did keep coming into the mid-1800s. It's hard to break, you know, 10,000 years.
Yeah.
You know, this is embedded into your DNA on every level. And it also worked. It's to talk about environmental sustainability and practices. This is it. Like, they'd come and they let everything replenish back north, come down here, come back north, move to maybe a different village location for a few years to grow and pick and harvest. And then they do the cycle over, but they would change their spots, so just enough to let things, as my mom would say, bounce back. So there's always this bouncing back. Mm-hmm. And then when things get altered in the, you know, mid-18 or 1830s, you have to choose one spot. You know, it's either choose one spot or out west. And so this cycle is starting to be slowly, well, actually very quickly altered by this time period. And my ancestors just stopped coming down here as a living pattern. But then in the 20th century, people would start kicking back in, and they come down here for work. There's a relocation program in the 1900s. It's very complicated. It's a federal program that allowed Native people to relocate to urban areas for work. It sounds good on paper, but in a lot of practices, it was still breaking up families and communities. And sometimes people get here, and there wasn't all these services and things they needed in place. So it's a complicated. Everything with Natives is complicated. I'm just gonna put that out there. This is another instance of that. So people started to come back and interact with the area in a different way, but not in the same manner. And so I feel like I'm following in my ancestors' footsteps as coming back and meeting and talking. This is as human as it gets to have a conversation. And, my ancestors were in these same places for hundreds, thousands of years, meeting and having conversations on multiple different levels. So this area, in my mind, it's part of I keep coming back to the spider web.
Mm-hmm.
There's all these touch points for the Odawa all through this. And I'm only here to talk about the Odawa. I can't talk about anybody else. And we're not all Indians. We're all distinct sovereign nations. And it's really, refreshing to work on the Indigenous Chicago project, because we had all these different voices come into this. What does this mean to you from your tribal's perspective? And sometimes tribes didn't get along. I mean, newsflash, we're humans, we fight, and then we, come to conclusions of peace and goodwill, and then we fight again. So this is one of those areas too, of conflict and resistance and misunderstanding. And with the little education I had about the War of 1812 in public schools, it was just this horrible thing happened at Fort Dearborn. It's all the Indians' fault, and that's that. This is why they're savages. Literally, that was the rhetoric. But then digging deeper into this, and it's complicated, but understanding what was going on in the bigger picture of this area of the Great Lakes.
Yeah.
So there's never one side of the story ever with any of this. I'm really very grateful to have multiple perspectives on the stage tonight, especially another Anishinaabe person. I usually don't share the stage with another Anishinaabe person, so it's very welcoming. But then I also, like I mentioned earlier, it's humbling, because just to be honest, I'm up here with a individual whose tribe suffered the policy of removal. And that's something I talk about all the time in classrooms. All these Potawatomi are removed, all these tribes are removed, but we avoided removal through, actions that we had to take. But then some of our brethren, that's not the case. Mm-hmm. So to be on the stage in this place that's Indigenous I got some feelings going through me right now. Yeah. There's some thoughts about this.
The question was about kind of more recent engagement with this place, right? So removal happens, right? And as Eric just kind of referenced, right? The people have heard of the Trail of Tears, I'm assuming, right? But the Trail of Death is the Potawatomi version of that, right? Which is just as bleak as anything that happens in the South, and yet Potawatomi people, Anishinaabe people, Indigenous people continue to have a presence in Chicago well after the 1830s. So that's kind of what we were just talking about, and I'm sure you have thoughts on the Potawatomi connection back to Chicago in the late 1800s and the 20th century and the 21st century, right?
Yeah. Wow.
That's a big question.
That's a huge question. And I apologize, I had to step out. But ditto to what Eric had mentioned. We actually just learned earlier, right before we got started here, that my sixth great grandfather is probably one of his relatives also. So that's
this is Indian
works,
country,
right?
101. I mean, this is
but and I have to take a moment to recognize the community here in the Chicagoland area. Our folks have always been here, under whatever the circumstances may have been at the time. And they've maintained a presence. They've maintained that link to our homelands here. And so, I always want to acknowledge the folks that have been here, that are still here. And, I'm happy to say that our folks, in April of this year, had some of our treaties recognized by the Department of Interior. And so now Prairie Band Potawatomi also, we're back in Illinois also. So, that's a bit overwhelming, because as I mentioned, my sixth great grandfather had lands reserved via treaty back in the 1800s. And the Trail of Death, as it's called, as it's known, we ended up in a section of what is now northeast Kansas before Kansas was ever even a territory. And when we got there, he came down to check on the people, to check on his family. And when he came back to Illinois, his home was gone. and he was prohibited from occupying the lands that were supposed to be reserved via treaty for him. And that's when he started, the process of the litigating, of the talking to folks, trying to advocate to anyone who would listen that no, these treaties are, according to your Constitution, the supreme law of the land. These are legally binding contracts that your nation entered into with our nation in exchange for ceded lands, for other resources and materials. And, for us to see at least a portion of that come to resolve this year in 2024, almost 200 years later, is just overwhelming, and it's an incredible experience.
That's great. I'm conscious of our clock, and so we've got one last big question, right, to kind of think through together, and before we open it up to questions from all of you out there. And this is about, the story we tell about Indigenous Chicago. So we've got a great exhibit that both of you consulted on. We've got ongoing momentum here at the Newberry, and I think in wider Chicagoland, kind of a growing awareness that this is indeed an Indigenous place that has an Indigenous history, but also an Indigenous present. And kind of revealing this story of Chicago as an Indigenous place and its history. What does it do for us, right? What is our takeaway from rethinking Indigenous Chicago? What does it tell us about this place? What does it tell us about Indigenous history more generally? What does it tell us about, the history of this continent more generally? I'm really anxious and eager to hear what both of you think of that very big picture question. But, as I think about it, in my own mind, the story of Chicago tells us a few things, right? It shows us, on one hand, that there's deep layers of Indigenous history at sites like Chicago and all across the continent, right? It's not just on the reservation lands, it's not just the Wild West, but literally every space, every corner of North America has a deep Indigenous past to it, right? And deep connections between Indigenous people and the land there. And oftentimes, as we've seen up here on stage, it has a deep connection to multiple Indigenous groups, right? So there are some people who live on this land and make it their own, the Potawatomi. There are other groups that travel through this space, right? There are Illinois traders, there are Meskwaki, there are any number of other groups in the region that kind of use Chicago as a site of mobility. And then there are other groups that come in seasonally, right? To meet with kin, to trade, to hunt, to fish, to trap furs, whatever. And that's still true even today. So that's one thing it tells me, right? The other thing I think is that Chicago is a clear example of how in the environment and the spaces and places of the continent directly influence the way incoming Europeans interact with native peoples on the continent, right? So whether it's through coexistence and cooperation in these glimpses of moments, or the kind of overarching narrative of conquest and kind of exploitation that takes place in Chicago, but really kind of ongoing across the continent, it's all wrapped up not just in the Indigenous history, but also the environmental history of these places. So that's what I think of, but I'm, of course, super interested to hear what both you think as well.
Well, I spend a lot of time with students, and it's the best part of my day, even though it's really frustrating with kids, but it's the best part. And this question, like, what is Chicago and what it means, and students ask us about any place in America. So Chicago could be this reflection of America.
Yeah.
There's loss, there's perseverance, there's people still here, there's conflict, there's violence, there's removal, there's coming back. So it can kind of reflect a little bit on what America is. And as I come down here, and I'm always sort of in awe in a bad way of just how much concrete and just how condensed.
Yeah.
I grew up in a village of 300 people. It was awesome. So I come to places like this, like, where's my water? Where do I get my food? Why there's so many people here? It's like, it's just so packed. But through all these different layers, there's Indigenous story, there's Indigenous people, there's Indigenous representation going on. So that's really encouraging. And I'll end my piece tonight with an example of my experience with a third grade. Third grade's not my strength. They're high school, middle school, college, but third grade, they're just wild. You don't know what they're going to do. Are you going to bite me? You're going to claw me? But my best experiences have been with third grade, so I can't talk too much smack. And I was doing this exhibit at a local museum up north on the War of 1812. Removal, resistance, conflict, staying home, what home means, how important home is. We're still here. And so my local teachers and museum people are like, Eric, can you give a talk to the third grade? I'm like, no, I can't. I don't know how to talk to these people. They're like, no, just go down there and talk about the exhibit and point out the pictures, and they love that stuff. I'm like, all right, and you got 10 minutes. I'm like, oh, what's going to sink in this kid's brain in 10 minutes? Nothing. So I go through my routine and talk mainly about home, how important it is. But before we get started, the teachers pull me aside and like, Eric, there's this kid over here. He's autistic, but he's with us and he does his things, but don't let it throw you off. And like, all right, and like he unbuttons his shirt up and down, ties his shoes off and on, but he'll do this off, the whole time. So right on cue, shirt up and down, shoes tied and untied. So I get into my talk and about home and whatnot, fighting for home, and so I finish and I'm like, okay, I made it. And I was like, any questions? And that kid who raised his hand, but he wouldn't make eye contact. And he said, do the Odawa have a place where they can be themselves today? Mm. Like he nailed it on every level, quicker than any adult ever got it. Yeah. That stuck. I never forget that. And I couldn't answer. I was just stunned. And the teacher's like, what do we do? I'm like, nothing. We just let it marinate. We just sit with this. Then he got up and left. Like he just built it all up and he's like, I'm done. And I was like, wow, it just really just overwhelmed me. And it still does. And that's the question I keep coming back to is like, do Native place have a place where they can be themselves? Yes and no, maybe. It's all of the above. But for him to like think about that so quickly and voice it, he didn't hold back. And so I was getting emotional. I was getting very worked up. And then I was like, any other questions? And this girl raised her hand and she's like, my dad's an Indian, he shot a deer. I'm like, okay, we're back to third grade. I got you. Yep, he's Indian, shot a deer. I live in a teepee, we're all good. So you never know who you're going to reach. You never know who's listening, how they're going to listen. So having these programs, programs and the exhibit and what we're doing, it needs to be sustained. It needs to be going out into all these different populations. And to do it at the Newberry or any institution that when I was growing up was largely this place that was untouchable. Like I read about it. It's like, that's a really big library. I'll never go there. And it looks cool and I like to read. And then here we are sitting on the stage with other, individuals from all across the country. So that's Chicago, though, in my mind, is an Anishinaabe person of coming together. And, the transportation, but also the internal movement of thinking, broadly, thinking outside of yourself, traveling to different places, thinking differently, opening up your mind. I mean, Chicago to me has been that place for a long time. And so it's really nice to be in that place again.
I mean, it's all in the name, right? It's all in the name. Chicago is an adaptation of one of our words, what we use to describe this area. And so, yeah, I mean, we've always had a presence here. And I think to the representation point, it's time to have those conversations, right? And like what we're doing here this evening, and other opportunities that have been created here recently. Individuals such as Eric and myself, working with individuals such as John, we have those opportunities to speak from our perspective. For so long, all the information, all the history has been imposed upon us to accept without consideration. But I'm thankful today, this evening, that we're here in a place where we can share a little bit more of the entire story.
That's a great note to end on, and I think we'll open it up for questions at this point. They're gonna hand this to me, and I'm gonna try to quickly, read through this and pose some questions to my fellow panelists here. Some of these are going to be specific. Some of them are going to be bigger. So let me. Oh, here's one that we can start with. This is an easy one for Raphael. Who was the sixth great grandfather, and where was he living before he was ordered to relocate to Kansas? Can we hear a little bit more about him?
Okay, so he wasn't specifically ordered to relocate to Kansas, but how we pronounce the name is Shabni. That's how we've always done it. Then there's other variations. I'll say variations. I used the word that wasn't that friendly the last time I talked about it, but Shabana, Shabona, Shabane are all variations of his name, and he was in many conflicts in this area, but specifically after Tecumseh had fallen, he reevaluated the position and wanted to take a stance to try to ensure survival of our people, which, I guess I'm a testament to. I'm here with you this evening. But yeah, so it was Shabni, and as was mentioned in the 1833 Treaty of Chicago, the land that was reserved for him in the Treaty of Prairie du Chien was acknowledged and upheld, because it was slated for, like many other lands that were reserved for other chiefs, it was slated for termination, but it was protected in that Treaty of Chicago. And, so that's, again, part of that whole history almost 200 years later.
Great. This is a question probably for all of us. But Eric, you mentioned the upcoming anniversary of the Revolutionary War and American independence, but how should we recognize the 200 years of native removal in Illinois and Wisconsin coming up in 2032? Should this be commemorated, mourned? How best should we mark that less celebratory anniversary?
I don't know if I would use a term like celebratory, like educate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just put it out there.
Yeah.
These are the facts. This is what happened. This isn't revisionist history. We're not canceling anything. This is straight fact.
Yeah.
And we're not rewriting anything. We're adding to. We're adding to this very complicated story that's the United States. And this is part of the story that's very local. And, there's removal, there's warfare, there's dispossession, there's people coming back, there's people that never come back. So I just call it education.
Mm-hmm.
That's the best way I can frame this. And yes, there's going to be withdrawal from this information. There's going to be pushback. There's going to be denial. There's going to be guilt. All of this is going to happen as the story comes out because it's an ugly story.
Yeah.
But it's a true story. And if my third graders can handle it, adults can handle it.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. I always tell my students at Texas Tech that we can't sugarcoat it. We got to give them the good, the bad, and the ugly of American history. And
Native people have been living this for 500 years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
People can hear it for the next couple of years.
That's right. Yeah. If it makes you squirm, it's probably true, right? Yeah. I think that's right. There's a few questions on here kind of asking about the specifics of how the portages here at Chicago worked. I'm happy to tackle a little bit of that. Do you want to say anything about that? I'm kind of grouping a few questions here on, what the actual mechanics of a portage look like, or a portage.
Well, from my tribe's perspective, we're 100% water people. Odawas are on the water as long as the water was open, canoeing, traveling, trading, fishing, warring, making peace. And so they're real scientists. They knew how waterways work. They could read the weather when the weather was more stable. We're having this conversation now with climate change because traditionally certain months were told by the moons and what was going on in your environment around you. So, for example, March would be Zizbaktagangisis, that's a sugar moon, when you make maple sugar. And you could literally set your clock to these phases of the moon, like I'm gonna meet you on such and such day of Zizbaktagangisis at Waganakising, and they'd be there within the day, you know, because they could tell the weather in the season. But now, sometimes we don't make maple sugar in March. So is it now the sugaring moon? Maybe it's something else. So this is all things that we're grappling with, and this is also in relation to environment. But traditionally, they could travel great distances. They could come down here very quickly, make decisions, engage. And so knowing the waterways, how they operated, and just the vastness of them. They were just incredibly vast and very different, you know, with animals, bugs, you know, trees, plants. They knew all these things as they went south, east, west, north, and how to adapt to them. And then also the different environments that you're going into with other people, that they would have these boundary lines and you had to have permission to go into these places. And if you didn't have permission, there's gonna be some trouble. Here they had permission. And that was through a lot of marriage. You start having families with people, it makes things easier.
Yeah.
To have, maybe it makes it harder though too, but but they had these very intricate social networks too, with the waterways.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm thinking, you know, Chicago specifically, but this is true for portages all over the Great Lakes. It's an indigenous invention, right? I'm in my book, I call it an indigenous technology to unite these multiple watersheds through carrying places, right, portages, alongside lightweight birch bark canoes. So you couldn't have done this with heavier vessels. You had to have the lightweight birch bark canoes that Native people are expert builders of, right, and they had perfected that technology long before European arrival. Even after the French, the British, the Americans get into the Great Lakes, they are happy to defer to indigenous expertise on building these canoes. So Michilimackinac becomes the canoe center of the upper Great Lakes because Odawa boat builders are there constructing these canoes and selling them at high prices to the French fur traders. And the other ingenious element to these birch bark canoes, right, apart from being able to carry them from waterway to waterway, is that, okay, you stove a hole in your boat, right, because you've hit a rock or you've come ashore too hard. All around you, right, the environment around you in the Great Lakes has birch bark, has pitch, has all of the tools you need to continue to repair those birch bark canoes all the way through the Great Lakes until you get down to places like Chicago, which is really a transit point. At Chicago, historically, you would exchange those birch bark canoes for the heavier dugouts of the Illinois country, right? Because as you go down the Illinois River and enter the Mississippi, you're entering muddier waters. You're going to hit sawyers and submerged logs and things like that. And so Chicago becomes, right, a key transition zone in that waterborne network of indigenous travel that Europeans quickly try to learn and utilize for their own purposes as well. The question was kind of specifically about how the portages were working here in Chicago. And there were, it seems, multiple routes at any given time. Some of this varied seasonally, right, as waters rose and fell. Some of it varied on who you were friends with or who you were intermarried with. So if you're intermarried with the people living on the northern route and you're at odds with the people living on, let's say, a lesser southern route, you're probably going on the main northern route, right? But it would vary really season to season and kind of decade to decade, I think, based on the historical sources I've sifted through. Any thoughts on the specifics of the portages?
I mean, it sounds like you've encapsulated it.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Yeah, we've got other questions, and being conscious of time, we probably have time for one or two more, depending. This is a good one to clarify. So are the current indigenous communities in Chicago all related to historic indigenous populations, or does this include tribes that weren't originally from the general region is the question being posed.
Well, I know we got some Dene in the house, so I don't know that they were historically, physically connected here. But like I mentioned earlier, you know, we had large gathering places across the country, and so it wouldn't be unheard of, you know, to know of somebody from the Southwest or even South America to have a presence here, because as the science will tell you now that it's catching up, there are remnants of these interactions that you know are all over the place today.
That's great. This one is about more environmental kind of history of this space. So the question is about the historic relationship here in Chicago between the waterways, the beaver, and the wild rice, traditional food crop. And I'm thinking of other things too, obviously birch bark being another key kind of environmental touchstone here. Thoughts on wild rice, beaver populations, the waterways of Chicago?
I mean, I didn't eat before I came over. So. So he was talking about some foods, and I didn't eat dinner yet, so I was getting a little hungry.
Well, from my understanding, like there was this very, very sophisticated trade network on food before Europeans knew about this place. And it was who had what. And I argue with my people back home on multiple things, but wild rice wasn't a big crop for us up north. We just didn't have the environment for it. So we would trade corn pretty much everywhere, and fish. That's like 80% of our diet is corn and fish. And they would actually cook it together. I don't know about that sometimes, but they would trade for all this stuff constantly, and they would do it in these canoes. And these canoes were like the freighters of the day. They could haul tons of goods. 2-3 tons of corn is a lot of corn. But you go up north, they don't have the growing season, but they have all the moose meat and the caribou and the elk and everything else. And then you come down south, and they don't have all the proteins of the north. So there's this very sophisticated, well-oiled machine of trade of food and goods and services, to some degree. Like maybe somebody's an expert canoe maker. They go down south and they'll hook it up. But food was a big one. So the food was not just for daily consumption. There's a term I really don't like. It's called hunter-gatherer. We're not that simple.
Yeah, right.
That's like caveman to me. Like, I'm just going to go and do this here and not do anything else. No, and the women were a very integral part in our society of setting prices, how much you're going to get if you got ripped off. They were, very much leaders in the economics of the day. So it was a community event. It wasn't just one or two guys. It was community, and it was based on their needs and what they could produce. So I could see them coming down here because maybe they grew more wild rice. And I could imagine getting tired of corn every day for maybe 6 months. And like, I need to eat something else. Go south, come back, and don't come back with an empty canoe. So they would do this, and it was routine all the time. So I could see this area being that. And also medicinal plants. And my mom worked for a tribe in their traditional medicine program for 30 years. So she knows a thing or two about plants. And I should be paying attention more to her, but she would say all the good stuff is in the wetlands, like all the medicinal plants, all these things that we need to heal ourselves because people did get sick and get hurt, and a lot of it was in wetlands. So I can see, my ancestors coming down here and getting plants that don't really thrive up north, certain, medicines. And medicines is a complicated word. We use it for a lot of different things, internal, external, spiritual, physical, emotional. So it's not just, I cut myself, I got an owie. There's a lot of different medicines.
Yeah, good. Well, the last question we've got time for tonight is about restoring lands to more natural states. So we've mentioned concrete, we've mentioned reversals of rivers, we've mentioned sewage and sanitation, right? But now that people are working to restore the lands and waterways around Chicago to more natural states, what are your thoughts on the process of making rivers like Chicago more wild and accessible to appreciate natural ecology and perhaps even kind of reminding us of what was here and what was lost beforehand? Thoughts on on the environment as it exists today and maybe as it should exist going forward? There are beavers again in the Chicago River up north. It's a
So
big thing.
I guess what comes to mind for me is just balance. And, one of the things that I was taught when I started learning how to hunt and fish and trap was we only take what we need. And we're always respectful of that. And so I guess that would be, the thing that I would encourage folks as we move forward today is, be respectful and let's try to maintain that balance because we've been out of balance for a long time, right? And so now we're at a point where we need to get back into balance. And, whatever that looks like, I'm not sure, but, that would be the goal.
It's so many levels. I'm thinking like Asian carp, and that's knocking on the door to the Great Lakes. I'm thinking pipelines. We have a big one going through the Straits of Mackinac, Line 5 right now, and it's old, and there's a lot of attention on this pipeline as we speak. So there's things that are already happening in the Great Lakes, and Chicago is part of this. And if Line 5 goes in Mackinac, it's going to affect Chicago to some degree. The oil will come down here. If the Asian carp break through, it'll affect us in northern Michigan. So, yeah, this balance, and we're all connected. I kind of laugh when I see a map that says Lake Michigan, Lake Huron. They're all it's all the same lake.
Yeah.
You can't have a line at the Straits of Mackinac saying it's one body of water than the other. There's different laws and different, regulations for this. It has to apply across the board, and always being mindful of who you're voting for and, their policies on the environment and what they're doing for this and that. So I get asked the question quite a bit, like, what can I do from, different, populations? And you're not going to fix us. We'll fix ourselves. Mm-hmm. But the environment is what needs fixing, and that's the fight. And if we can all get all hands on deck with the environment, and as one of my elders said, I know it's very cliche to say that, but I keep coming back to it, it's like if there's no healthy environment, there's no healthy people. And we're just going to keep spinning out of balance indefinitely. And so if we can get that, and we seen a pretty remarkable thing a few years ago at Standing Rock where people came together for water. And then people came out of that, but we have our own standing rocks here in the Great Lakes, and it's at a critical mass. The lakes are warming at an alarming rate. They don't freeze over anymore. I have friends who are commercial fishermen for a tribe. They have to go further out every year to get fish because they're not coming in because the lakes are so warm. That's a really telling tale that these fish that have been sustainable for us as Native people for thousands of years aren't coming home to us. That's a pretty big warning. So I think the environment needs our help in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's a sober but important note probably to end on then. So thank you both for being up here with me. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much.